The candle had burned low enough to gutter, and Cecily Harlow did not stop to trim it. She stood in the estate's paper room at 3 in the morning with the genuine marriage register pressed against her chest, her back to the door. She had pried with a hairpin, her breath shallow, and even in the particular way her father had taught her to hold it when she was frightened. "Do not let the paper shake," he used to say. "A trembling hand is a careless hand." So she stilled her hands. She stilled them against the vellum-bound cover of the register, against its cracked spine and the water stain that bloomed across its lower corner like a brown tide. And she made herself look at what she had come to find. The false document lay on the central table where she had left it when she first discovered it, 3 days ago. It was a convincing forgery. She had spent 30 minutes the previous afternoon, confirming that it was convincing, pressing a magnifying glass to the date line and watching the ink show itself as it truly was, too pale where it ought to have been dark. The oxidation flattened, the hand in the date column, not the rounded backward slope of old Mr. Rawle, Devereux's clerk's pen, but a hand she had seen before on a letter of introduction, pressed into her own palm 6 weeks ago, in a receiving room in Harley Street. Mr. Plank, Mr. Gerard Felton's hand, upright and rapid, not quite disguised by the wider nib he had used. She had known then what he intended to do. She had known that in 8 hours he would stand before Lord Westerby and present that document as proof of a claim that would strip the Earl of Ashford of his estate, his title seat, and everything his dead brother had left in his care. She had known it, and she had not yet told the Earl, and the reason for her silence was one she did not allow herself to examine too closely. She was not certain he would believe a companion over a cousin's solicitor. For 3 days she had carried the knowledge as she carried most difficult things, quietly and with great care, the way her father had taught her to carry a document that was both fragile and urgent. She had gone about her duties. She had read aloud to Lady Felton. She had written correspondence. She had eaten her meals at the small table in the companion sitting room, and she had listened to the sounds of the house shifting around Felton's arrival, his solicitor's arrival, the installation of legal men in rooms that had not previously been used for such purposes, and she had kept her own counsel. She had returned to the paper room twice more to look at the false document under different light, morning light and afternoon light and the particular oblique light of late autumn. At 3 in the afternoon the fraud held in all of them. It was convincing to an untrained eye. It was unconvincing to hers. So she had waited for the night. She had waited until the house was quiet, and then she had taken her hairpin and her low-burning candle, and she had retrieved what she had come to retrieve. The register was the true one. She knew it as she knew her own father's handwriting. The ink had aged, honestly, brown at the edges and still faintly dark at the centers of the strokes, the way iron gall ink looked after 20 years of patient darkness. The date was right. The signature of the officiating clergyman was right. If she placed this document beside Felton's forgery in morning light before a man who knew what he was looking at, the fraud would be visible in under 10 minutes. There was still the matter of carrying it across the dark house. There was still the matter of where she was going, and what it would cost her to arrive there. She was not naive. She was 24 years old, a gentleman's daughter without a father, employed as a lady's companion in a house that was not hers to the wife of a man who was disputing its ownership, if she was found before morning, in the Earl of Ashford's private study, holding estate documents that had no business being in her hands, she would be dismissed. She would lose her situation. She would lose the 9 shillings a week. That was all the difference between her father's small legacy, lasting 2 years, and lasting 4. She would lose what her father had told her. On the last morning she had seen him would be a sound footing. Tense. She heard the old house settle around her in the dark, the particular creak of its timbers at that hour, and she thought about all the paperwork she had seen in 4 months at Ashvale House. The water accounts and the kitchen ledgers and the drainage correspondence and the 15 years of estate management her predecessor had kept in a confusion of different hands. She had ordered it all. She had done so because she was good at it, because she could hold the shape of a large set of records in her mind and move between them without losing the thread, and because she had no other skill that the world cared to acknowledge. She tucked the register beneath her arm and opened the paper room door. The corridor beyond was dark save for the thin strip of light under the study at the far end. He was awake. Then she had not been certain. She moved toward the light. Her father, Thomas Harlow, had spent 31 years as a solicitor in Chancery Lane, and he had brought Cecily into his offices from the age of 11. She had first come as a visitor who sat quietly in the corner and drew pictures on the backs of old briefs. By the time she was 14, she was making fair copies of routine correspondence. By 16, she was copying settlement documents and comparing contract revisions with an attention her father said was better than his own. By 20, she was doing work that 2 junior clerks together could not have matched for accuracy. And her father paid her a clerk's wage and pretended to the profession that she was a very efficient filing system rather than a thinking person. She had not minded the pretense when he was alive. It had been a small and necessary accommodation, the kind the world required of women who wanted to do useful things inside institutions designed for men. And she had made it without resentment because the work itself was real, and the wage was honest, and her father looked at her across a desk every morning with a respect that did not need to be performed for anyone else's benefit. Censid. When he died of a sudden apoplexy in the February of the year, she turned 23. The firm passed to her cousin Aldous, who arrived on the second morning of the mourning period to inspect what he had inherited. He inspected Cecily. As part of the inventory, she is only useful with paper. Not with persons, he told his wife that evening, in a voice that did not quite reach the door behind which Cecily stood. She will have to find a situation. She had found one. It had taken 4 months, and the assistance of a friend of her father's who knew a widow who needed a companion connected to the question of the Ashvale title. Lady Felton, wife to the man now claiming the estate, had taken on Cecily because she required someone to manage her correspondence, keep her household accounts in order while she lived as a guest of the disputed property, and read aloud to her after supper. She had not required, and had not expected, someone who would take an interest in the documents locked in the paper room. She is only the companion, Lady Felton had said to her husband, behind that same not-quite-closed door, when he had remarked that Cecily was in the library again. She handles paper, not persons. Leave her to it. Leave her to it. She had been left to it. The study door was not locked. She knocked once softly, and then turned the handle. Julian Vane, Earl of Ashford, was seated behind his desk in his shirt and breeches, a single oil lamp at his elbow, and an open volume of estate accounts before him. His dark coat was over the back of the chair. He looked up when the door opened, and for a moment he simply looked at her, the way he had a habit of doing in moments that required a response. Without any readable surface, without any traceable interior, the way certain documents gave back no light when held to a candle because they were written in sympathetic ink, his dark hair was not entirely in order. He had been sitting at that desk for some time. She set the register on his desk. The date on Mr. Felton's settlement document is incorrect, she said. The ink has not aged correctly, and the hand in the date column is his own. I cannot speak to whether a court would call it forgery or error, but the genuine filing register shows a date 12 days later than the one he has written. Under the entail provision he is claiming, 12 days makes the difference between a valid claim and no claim at all. He looked at the register. He did not look at her. "Where did you find this?" he said. "Behind a false panel in the paper room. I discovered it during the catalog you asked me to complete." "When?" 3 days ago. Something moved in his face. Not anger exactly. A tightening in the jaw that she had learned in the weeks since his return to Ashvale was his equivalent of a man raising his voice. "You have known for 3 days. I was not certain you would take it from me directly," she said. "I needed to verify the oxidation pattern before I brought you something I could not defend." He looked at her then, fully. It was a different quality of looking than he usually gave her when she set a document before him and waited for his instruction. This quality had more weight in it. She was aware of the low light and the late hour and what it meant that she was standing in this room. "You came through the house at 3 in the morning," he said. "Yes, my lord alone?" "Yes." He rose from behind the desk. He was taller than she, sometimes remembered when she was not in the same room with him, and he moved with the precision of a man accustomed to doing things correctly the first time. He came around the desk and lifted the register and opened it to the date page and stood reading it in the lamplight for a long moment, one hand flat against the table's surface. The lamp threw his profile in warm yellow shadow, the strong set of the jaw, the fine line of the nose, the particular stillness he carried in his body even when he was moving. "Tell me the difference," he said. "The iron gall ink in a 20-year-old document should have oxidized at the surface. The color would have shifted to brown at the stroke edges, while the centers held a darker tone. Mr. Felton's date line is uniformly pale. It is new ink treated to look old, and the treatment is not quite right. The genuine register has aged, honestly." He turned the page. He read. She waited, standing at the edge of the lamplight, and she thought about her father, who had told her that a good document spoke for itself if you knew how to let it. She thought about how still she had learned to stand in solicitors' rooms while men decided what to make of her. She had become very good at stillness. She had become so good at it that she sometimes wondered whether she had made herself too small to be found. The Earl of Ashford set the register down gently and said, "Who else has seen this?" "No one. Lord Westerby arrives at 8. His secretary is already in residence." He paused. "Felton's solicitor arrived this afternoon." "I know. I heard them in the hall." "Sit down," he said. She sat, in the chair before the desk, and he returned to his side of it. He did not immediately speak. He had the register open again, running his thumb along the spine with the careful attention of a man who handled things he wished to preserve. She watched his hand and thought about the register passing through the paper room. Panel undetected for 2 decades, patient in its hiding place, holding the truth in the dark. "My father signed this 20 years ago," he said at last. Edmund would have been 14. He did not finish the sentence. He did not need to. She had seen the portrait in the library. The young man with Julian's jaw and a lighter cast to his eyes, turned slightly toward the wall. She had not asked about it because some things in a house explained themselves. "Edmund was here when your father signed it," she said. He looked up. "He is listed as a witness." A minor witness, his signature small at the bottom of the page. He would have been present in the room. Julian sat with that for a moment. She could not see what the information cost him. His face had returned to its composed surface, but his hand had stilled on the register's spine. "My brother and I quarreled," he said in the leveled tone he used for practical disclosures. "Before I went to the peninsula, I wrote to him from Spain. The letter was returned unopened." He paused. "He was dead. 6 weeks before I was told." She said nothing. The lamp made its small sounds. "The portrait, in the library," she said. "The one turned toward the wall. I turned it when I came back. I could not look at him straight." He closed the register. "That was 2 years ago. I have not been able to turn it back." She understood then what his wound was. She understood it. The way she understood documents, not by inference, but by recognition. He believed he had been forgiven a debt he would never now be able to pay. He was carrying an account that could not be settled, the kind that stayed open, because the other party to it had gone where they could not be reached. "My father told me the morning he died that I would find a sound footing," she said. She did not know why she said it. It simply needed to be said. He believed that, completely. "I have spent the better part of a year wondering whether he was right, or whether it was kindness." Julian was looking at her again in that weighted way. "He was right," he said. She did not answer that. She was not yet certain he meant it as anything beyond a gentleman's courtesy, and she had learned to be careful about what she assigned to words spoken across a desk in the middle of the night. She had learned to hold in reserve what she most needed to believe. "I should return to my room." She said, "Yes." He did not move, Miss Harlow. What you did tonight, coming here, carrying this, risking your situation, the late hour, the talk that would follow if it were known." He stopped. "I am aware of what it cost. The document cost more not to carry," she said. She rose. She left the register where it lay. "If Cecily's courage in that corridor has you holding your breath, you are not alone. Stay with us." The morning came gray, and still the sky above the park wearing the particular exhausted white of November. Cecily dressed in her plainest gown and went down to Lady Felton's rooms to perform her ordinary duties, and for 2 hours she sat reading aloud from an improving volume, while Lady Felton reclined on a chaise and remarked at intervals that the hearing would be concluded by noon and the matter tidied before the month was out. She spoke of it with the confident ease of a woman who had never had occasion to doubt that things would arrange themselves in her favor. And Cecily read on without responding, because there was nothing to say that would not cost her something she was not yet prepared to spend. She had spent 3 days since the night she had stood in the study with the register open between them, learning to read a different set of documents. Julian Vane had called her to the library the following morning, formally, in the manner of an employer requiring assistance. He had 2 drainage surveys spread across the library table, and asked her to cross-reference the dates against a 3rd set of records she had not yet seen. She had done so. He had stood at the opposite side of the table throughout, and he had not looked at her directly until she placed her finger on a discrepancy in the 1903 records, at which point he had crossed to her side of the table without ceremony and looked where she was pointing. And they had stood together over the map with his shoulder an inch from hers and the warmth of the fire at their backs, and neither of them had mentioned the night before. He had asked for her opinion, again the following afternoon, in the middle of a meeting with his steward, sending the man out of the room on a brief errand, and asking Cecily, who had been sorting correspondence in the corner, as she often did, what she made of a particular codicil in the estate's management records. She had told him. He had listened, with complete attention, the kind of listening that does not arrange its response while the other person is still speaking. Then the steward had returned, and Julian had resumed the meeting, and he had not looked at Cecily again until she was leaving the room, at which point he had looked at her in exactly the way that had no readable surface. She had told herself very carefully that this meant nothing in particular. She had not quite believed herself. The house had a different quality that morning. The footman moved in careful arcs around whatever was happening in the north corridor. The cook sent up breakfast without the usual hot rolls, because, she would say later, the morning felt like a morning when no one would eat. Betestra. Cicely ate her plain bread and thought about ink oxidation, and said nothing that could be misconstrued. At 10:30, Lord Westerby's secretary, a narrow young man named Baird, knocked at the door of the room where Cecily had retreated to write up the account of the morning's household expenditures. He did not speak to her directly. He spoke past her shoulder to Lady Felton's footman, who had come to fetch a shawl, and his voice was at the precise volume of a man who does not care if he is overheard. Mr. Felton, he said, had raised a preliminary objection. The companion employed in the house had been found to have accessed the estate's paper room without authorization. She had been sorting through private documents of the Vane family for purposes that remained unclear. Felton felt it important to note, before proceedings commenced, that any material produced from the paper room by a person acting without the family's sanction should be treated with appropriate skepticism. She handled paper, after all, not persons. One could not be certain what a woman trained in that way might do to a document placed in her hands. Baird finished. He left. The footman left. Cecily set down her pen and listened to her own pulse and stared at the household ledger. She handles paper, not persons. She had heard that before. She had heard it in Chancery Lane in her cousin Aldous' voice. She had heard it through an almost closed door. She had heard it from Lady Felton in the drawing room when she thought Cecily was on the other side of the house. She had spent her entire professional life being the woman who was only useful in the absence of persons. The one you handed something to when you wanted it done, without any inconvenience to yourself, and then you set her in a corner and forgot that she was there while she remained precisely there, reading the room, seeing everything. She was very tired of it. From the direction of the north corridor, she heard the sound of Julian's study door opening and his footsteps going toward the hearing room. He did not come to find her. She sat with that for 10 minutes. She had told herself very carefully since the previous night that she did not expect anything from him. She had done what was right because it was right, and she would live with the outcome, and that was sufficient. Her father would have told her that too. He had told her many things. She was still learning to believe. The register was on Julian's desk. She had left it there. He had taken it into the hearing, presumably, or had not. She did not know. She had given it into his hands, and then she had gone back to her room and her gown and her household ledger, and that was where the matter stood. She picked up her pen and put it down again. She picked up her shawl. She sat for another moment. She thought about what her father would have told her to do. He had been a man who believed deeply in the proper exercise of competence, who had spent his life arguing that careful work was its own authority, and who had never, in 31 years of practice, walked away from a case because the client had not yet confirmed he wanted to win. He had told her once, in the last winter she had worked beside him, that the error most people made with difficult documents was waiting for permission to act on what they knew. She thought about the register. She thought about the way Julian had held it the previous night with both hands, as though it were a thing that could be lost again. She walked toward the hearing room. The door was thick, old oak, and she stood outside it for long enough to hear Felton's solicitor completing his presentation of the settlement document, the forged date read aloud in a carrying, confident voice. She heard Lord Westerby ask a clarifying question in his dry and judicial way. She heard the measured assent of Felton himself, already performing ownership of a room he had not yet legally acquired, the ease of a man who has never had occasion to doubt that arrangements made on his behalf will hold. Then she heard Julian's voice. "Miss Harlowe acts as my agent in all estate matters." The quality of silence that followed was the kind that occupies a room that was expecting something else entirely. Cecily opened the door. 11 people were in the room. Lord Westerby sat at the head of the table, white-haired and composed, with the particular settled calm of a man who has seen a great many claims and a great many frauds and fines, neither especially interesting, until the evidence is before him. Baird sat at his elbow with a pen. Felton's solicitor stood at the near end of the table, the forged document spread flat before him. Felton himself stood at the fireplace, and when Cecily entered he went very still in the manner of a man who has heard his bluff called, but has not yet decided how to respond to the calling. Lady Felton was seated near the window, her hands folded, her fan held at the measured height. She always held it when she wished to convey composure. The expression on her face was one Cecily had not seen there before. It was the first edge of uncertainty in a woman who had never previously had cause for it, and it sat on Lady Felton's features with the slight wrongness of a garment borrowed from someone else. Julian was standing beside the table. He did not look at Cecily when she entered. He looked at Lord Westerby. "My agent's evidence is relevant to the document your lordship has been asked to authenticate," he said, "with your lordship's permission." Westerby considered Cecily, over the tops of his spectacles, with the attention of a man who has spent 40 years separating relevant from irrelevant, and has become efficient at it. "Miss Harlowe," he said, "you have something to present." She came to the table. She set the register she had carried out of her room that morning, wrapped in her shawl, to look like nothing in particular, flat on the table beside the forged settlement. "The genuine filing register for the marriage settlement in question," she said. "I located it in the estate's paper room during a catalogue I was asked to complete by the Earl of Ashford. The document, Mr. Rodd. Felton's solicitor has produced claims a date of the 4th of March in the year 1799. The genuine register filed at the time of the settlement's execution records a date of the 16th. I can show your lordship the ink oxidation pattern on both documents." Westerby looked at Felton's solicitor. The solicitor looked at Felton. "The woman is a companion," Felton said. His voice was still controlled. "She has no standing in legal proceedings. Whatever she found in that room, whatever she believes she has identified, is the opinion of a household servant examining documents she has no qualification to interpret. I am the daughter of Thomas Harlow of Chancery Lane, Cecily said. She kept her voice level. I spent 9 years in my father's offices copying and comparing legal documents. I can speak to ink oxidation with some accuracy. Harlow, Westerby said. He looked at her with a different quality of attention. I knew your father. He argued the Maitland case in front of me in 1806. He paused. He was very precise with documents. Yes. My lord, she said. Westerby looked at the 2 documents. He produced his own glass from his coat pocket, a small silver-mounted lens on a folded arm, and he bent over the date lines of both documents for a period of time that lasted long enough for Felton to shift his weight 3 times and Lady Felton to close her fan with a small, precise snap. Westerby straightened. The dating on this settlement document is inconsistent with documents of its purported age, he said. He had the even informational tone of a man announcing the weather. I am not prepared to accept it as authentic without expert examination. He looked at Felton. I will suspend these proceedings pending that examination. If the document is found to be genuine, we will reconvene. If it is found to be otherwise, the matter is closed. Felton's solicitor began to speak. Westerby raised one hand and the solicitor stopped. The silence that followed had the quality of a door that has swung shut. Felton looked at it, and something in him recognized it, and the recognition moved through him in a way that settled his shoulders and stilled his hands and left him looking, for the first time since he had arrived at Ashvale, like a man who understood precisely where he stood. Lady Felton rose from her chair near the window. She stood for a moment in the manner of a woman who has run the same sentence through her mind several times and found that it no longer ends where she expected. The register, she said at last, half to herself and half to no one in particular. It was behind a panel. Yes, Cecily said. Lady Felton looked at her husband. Something passed between them that Cecily did not try to interpret. Felton's jaw had set into a line she recognized. Not defiance, but the first recognition that a strategy has been met with its own refutation. He left the room. Lady Felton followed him, and the solicitor gathered his papers with the concentrated motion of a man who intends to be elsewhere, and in a very short time, the hearing room contained only Lord Westerby, Baird. With his pen, Julian and Cecily, and the register lying open on the table between the forged document and the truth, Westerby shook Julian's hand. He spoke briefly, and with precision, about the examination that would be commissioned, and the expected result, and about the gratitude that a man in Julian's position owed to persons in his household who exercised good judgment. His eyes moved briefly to Cecily when he said this, and he gave a small nod, a thing she suspected he did not give often. Then he was gone. Julian stood at the window where Lady Felton had sat. He was looking out at the park, the gray sky above it, the bare arms of the lime trees. There was a long quiet. The solicitor's examination will take 3 weeks, he said. Yes. After which the claim will be found fraudulent and dismissed. I believe so. The register will need to go into the strongbox. He was still looking at the park. I should have seen to that from the beginning when we first discovered it. He paused. I did not see to it because I was not thinking about the strongbox. He turned from the window. I was thinking about Edmund being in the room when it was signed A minor witness. His signature small at the bottom of the page. She waited. I have been trying to settle something with a man who cannot answer me, Julian said. I had thought I would be doing so for the rest of my life. And then you told me his name was at the bottom of that register, and I thought he was 11 years old when our father signed it, and he must have sat very still and written his name very carefully, because that was the kind of child he was. I have been grieving a quarrel between 2 men, when what I have actually been missing is the boy who sat still and wrote carefully. His voice was level throughout. It did not change, and yet his hand had moved to rest against the window's frame, and she saw what the steadiness cost him. Cecily said, Yes. Yes, he repeated. That is exactly the right answer. He was looking at her directly, and there was nothing sealed in it now, nothing withheld or translated through social necessity. She felt it the way she felt a document that was genuinely old, an accumulated weight that could not be faked, that took years to produce and could not be imitated by anything applied to the surface. Afterward, her pulse was audible in the base of her throat. She was aware of how close she was standing to the window, and how the gray light found the angles of his face, and how utterly still the room had gone. "Cecily," he said. It was the first time she heard it settle in the room like a stone, placed carefully. "I intend to speak to you properly," he said. "Not across a desk in the middle of the night and not in a room that still smells of Felton's solicitor. When the house is quieter, if you are willing." She thought about a sound footing. She thought about what her father had believed and what she had spent a year learning to trust. "I am willing," she said. She said it plainly, the way she said most things that mattered, and he received it the same way, and neither of them performed anything about it. He simply looked at her for a moment, in the way she had come to understand, was the way he looked at things he intended to keep. 3 weeks later, on the first morning of December, the examination was concluded, and the result delivered, in a sealed communication from the expert examiner appointed by Lord Westerby. Cecily held the letter while Julian read it because she had by that time been asked in very direct terms to hold things that mattered and had accepted the request in the same direct terms it had been made. In the intervening weeks, she had learned the particular quality of his silences, how they were not empty but occupied, and what it meant when he paused before a question versus when he paused after one. She had learned that he took his coffee without sugar, and his correspondence in a specific order, and his meals standing at the library window, when the estate's affairs were heavy on him, and at the table, like a civilized person when they were not. She had learned that he would speak her name once in the course of an ordinary morning's work, for no reason other than to say it, and that she had ceased pretending not to notice when he did. She had learned the shape of the portrait in the library, Edmund Vane's lighter eyes, and his slight asymmetric, almost smile, still facing the wall. She had not turned it herself. She had waited. She had also learned, with the helpless specificity of a body that does not ask permission, that she was conscious of exactly where he was in any room they shared. She knew the sound of his step on the library floorboards and the particular pause of it when he stopped behind her to look at whatever she was working on. She knew the quality of warmth that preceded him when he came to stand at her elbow, and the way the air in a corridor changed when he had recently been in it. She had noted these things with the same precision she brought to documents, and she had filed them away in the same internal register where she kept things that were true but could not yet be acted upon. And she had gone on doing her work. He had asked her on the 4th day to take a turn in the kitchen garden before the light failed. He had offered his arm. She had taken it. They had walked the length of the kitchen garden and back again without speaking of anything consequential, and it had been the most pleasant 20 minutes she could remember in a year, and she had gone to bed thinking about her father's faith in sound footings, and found for the first time in a long while that she believed him. The letter confirmed what she had known since the first evening. She held a magnifying glass over an ink line that told the wrong story. The false claim died in the examiner's report, clean and without ceremony, the way frauds did when you had the patience to wait them out. Julian placed the letter on the desk. He looked at it for a moment, and then he looked at her. "It is done," he said. "Yes," she said. He rose. He crossed to her in 2 deliberate steps, and he took her hand from where it rested at her side and held it. He held it with the same careful attention he had given the register's spine, the same quality of preservation. "What you did that night," he said. "The hairpin, the dark corridor, everything you risked." "I told you," she said. "The document cost more not to carry." "Yes," he said. "And I have been thinking about that for 3 weeks, about how that sentence reflects a kind of judgment I cannot educate a person into, and cannot purchase, and cannot compel." He paused. "Your father was right. You found a sound footing." Her hand was very warm inside his. She thought about her father's faith, held honestly for a year in the dark the way a genuine document held its ink, and she did not speak because there was nothing to say that would have been equal to the quiet. He raised her hand and pressed his lips to it, briefly, precisely, with the restrained and exact quality of a promise made in full knowledge of its cost. Then he turned and picked up the register from the desk. Together they went to the strongbox. Julian placed the letter inside and then the register beside it. The vellum-bound cover with the cracked spine and the water-stained lower corner that had waited 20 years in a false panel to be found by someone who knew how to look. He turned the key. He set it on the mantelpiece. They went to the library. The fire was lit, and the afternoon light fell through the long windows in the particular flat gray way it did in early December. That specific quality of English winter light that softened everything it touched. Julian crossed to the wall where Edmund's portrait hung. He turned it fully to face the room. The young man in the portrait had his brother's jaw, and a lighter cast to the eyes, and a slight asymmetry at the left corner of the mouth that looked, if you studied it, like someone who had just finished trying not to smile, and had not quite succeeded. His signature was small at the bottom of the genuine register. Patient in the dark for 20 years. Julian stood before the portrait for a long moment. Cecily came to stand beside him, close enough that the back of his hand brushed hers at his side, and he turned his hand until it held hers without any formality about it. Neither of them said anything, because there was nothing more that needed to be said. The account that could not be settled had found its way through the particular patience of honest documents, and the particular courage of a woman who would not let a fraud go to mourning unchallenged, to a kind of peace. The register sat in the strongbox. The fire held its warmth against the December quiet. Edmund Vane faced the room from his gilt frame, his almost smile held for 20 years, waiting to be seen. Thank you for staying to the end of this story. If the moment Cecily opened that door moved you, leave a thought in the comments. We would love to hear which moment stayed with you longest. Ashvale held its warmth around them. The key was on the mantelpiece.